Everybody, and welcome to Georgetown Lit Fest, and welcome to this event on the future of festivals. And it's quite exciting to have a discussion in the context of a festival. It sort of feels thrillingly meta. I'm going to, we've got a fantastic panel who I'm going to introduce in a moment. My name is Adam Pushkin. I've produced a lot of festivals myself, mostly in the UK, but I've also I worked for the British Council in India and Indonesia for many years. So I've got a particular interest in festivals all around the world. Hardesh is the founder and director of Kuala Lumpur Festival. Nadira is a filmmaker and independent film programmer from Sabah. Daniel is the founder of Think City. You're not the founder. I've promoted you. Is that okay? Okay. Daniel's the best person at Think City. And Sharaad. And Sharaad is a journalist and cultural commentator, and they'll probably say a little bit more about each of them, what they do and their particular perspectives on festivals as we go on. So we're going to try and get under the skin of festivals a little bit, why we go to them, why some of us appear at them, why all these people pay for them. Obviously, human beings have been creating festivals for thousands of years, and here we are still doing them right now. There's obviously something deep in our psyches that needs this. I'm going to start with Nadira. I'd be interested in your perspective from Sabah, where I know there are a lot of festivals as part of life in Sabah. But what's your perspective on the purpose of festivals? Why does it all happen, and whom does it serve?
Sorry, I had to take a moment to digest that. Because the thing is just like what we had spoken about earlier is that, I mean, as far as my experience goes, I have been a programmer for a film festival prior, but I mean, that was in an urban setting and it was for a corporation. But then coming from Sabah and being indigenous as well, I mean, the biggest festival that we have there is the Kuttan Rice Harvest Festival. And so, I mean, within that festival, you know, it's not a place to necessarily exchange ideas, but it is a place to celebrate culture and perpetuate culture. And so one of the biggest things, because it's a month-long sort of a festival and a celebration, the biggest highlight of it is actually a cultural pageant, which some people call a beauty pageant, called the Unduk Ngadao. So for one whole month, sort of like you would have women primarily who actually compete to become the personification of Huminodun, who is the goddess who sacrificed herself so that people can eat. It's kind of like Jesus, except that ours is a woman, you know, and instead of sacrificing herself for our sins, she sacrificed herself so that we can eat. But it's kind of evolved over time and become a pageant because of this colonial leftovers, that when the British would come, they want to be able to sort of see this parade of beautiful women wearing traditional costumes, and suddenly it's become embedded within our indigenous culture, but people are not able to separate the two, tradition and sort of like the leftovers of colonialism. And so I think that between like sort of an agriculture festival and, you know, more contemporary festivals such as these literary festivals, film festivals, the common tie that I would have with all of them is the absolute need for diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that it doesn't become a beauty pageant. The Undung Ado doesn't become a beauty pageant, but a space where we can talk about feminist ideals and animism.
That's really interesting. Hardesh, let's come to you next, because you have created and sustained a festival in Kuala Lumpur in a very different context from Sabah. What's your perspective on why would you go to all that work? What's and whom do you think it's for?
Thanks, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. So I think there's like everything now, there's a before COVID and after COVID perspective on this. You know, before COVID, the reason in our case, when we did the festival, it was really because there was an economic motivation behind it. There was, of course, a community purpose behind it as well. But a big part of it really was about, just bringing entertainment to people. Now, entertainment, of course, can take many forms, whether it's through literature, whether it's through music, whether it's through dance, whether it's through poetry. But after COVID, I think that is what all of us here are trying to figure out, like why go through all that trouble, right? I mean, there has to be a bigger reason for it, and it cannot just simply be for people to come, have a good time. Maybe they leave with a better cultural outlook, but then what happens after that? So I think my criticism, even in the work that we did, was that it was always quite short-term. You come for a festival for that week, you probably have fun, but then after that, everything just dissipates. In terms of what happens after that, I think this is where we really have to try and understand what can festivals do in terms of trying to answer some of the bigger challenges we have, whether it's political, whether it's climate, whether it's environment, whether it's diversity. And I think all of us prior to this have not done a good enough job at addressing those. So that probably would be the challenge.
Speak for yourself. I'll come to Sharaad in a moment. He's clearly itching to get in. But I'm keen to hear from you, Daniel, because I know that you work with a lot of festivals and in the broader policy context, right? How does it look from your angle?
So Think City is an impact organization, and we look at culture-based urban generation. We don't run festivals, but we work closely with festivals, as you said. For example, like Georgetown Festival, or even the Butterworth Fringe Festival, or even in Johor, the Tribute Art Festival, etc. The nature of the work is actually a lot of our work are place-making work. So we look at festival as a tool towards placemaking, and that means that we're looking at how the festival could actually build community if curated in a certain way. How does it help to celebrate or appreciate the tangible or intangible heritage in the city? And of course, we also look at it in terms of content creation and how does it spur innovation. So a lot of times during the festival, it might be fun times, etc. But what it does is actually sets a platform to springboard ideas, and you build from it as well. So from our point of view, a lot of times we always look at what happens after the festival, and how do we leverage on the festival to actually help the city rejuvenate. So it's pretty much from that angle. And
Sharaad, I'm interested in your perspectives on these questions. What do you see as the role of festivals in contemporary society?
So where do we begin? Okay, so I would say that Hardesh, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a good time and just having a good time. I'm going to say that. I want to put it out there. So I was also co-director of the Georgetown Lit Fest, this festival, a couple of years ago, 2019, 2020, and it straddled the pre-COVID, COVID era, and I think we're still not out of COVID, just that we've come to some accommodation, and almost a modus vivendi with the virus, right? So we're still in COVID in some sense, but I think what COVID did was it threw everything up in the air because people couldn't gather. It was a simple material fact of festivals is that people gather. And Nadira very eloquently points us in the direction of what traditional festivals do, right? People gather, there's ritual, there's community making. Part of the modalities of that might be something like a pageant, and so on and so forth. So when I think about festivals, I think I'd like to see a festival that has all these different characteristics, but having also traveled to various literary festivals in the last couple of years, I see very different styles, and some of it comes out from the model that's driven by. So Jaipur is driven by the publishing industry in India, Dhaka, very, very different logic, and so on. But a lot of them have stars, they have some celebrity dimension, and in fact, many of the festivals I've seen elsewhere are very festive. I think that's actually a strange quality that one sort of like, well, okay, is this festival actually festive, or does it feel like an academic conference? Which I think is one of the dangers. Okay, so when I looked at the title, very quickly, Adam, I would say Future of Festivals. I would focus on the word future. And my question would be, what concessions are we making to the future? And by which I mean future audiences, the future of the implicit economies of, that are implicated in this, say for instance, publishing industry, the tourism industry, the experience economy, all these things, right? What concessions are we making to that future? And what is it about the choices that we're making now, in the present, that suggests that we are willing to make concessions to that future, or are in fact fighting against it because we come from a position where we are defending an idea of a festival that comes out from a very different time, a past. So when you want to talk about time, and you want to talk about the future festivals, yeah, that was my question. What concessions are we making to the future?
And does anybody have an answer? I mean, in a sense, I mean, those of us who've run festivals are aware of the compromises that are necessary. We've got all these potential, we've got all these stakeholders. We've got all these stakeholders in the room. We've got the need to juggle millions to keep lots of plates spinning in order to keep a lot of different people happy. And I think implicit in in Sharaad's challenge is a question of choice. It's a question of what sort of festivals are we aiming to create, and in a post-COVID future, what is the priority? I mean, for you, Hardesh, as you come from several years of running a festival, then having a hiatus for COVID, do you have a renewed sense of how you're navigating that challenge that Sharaad has put?
Yeah, I think let me try and touch on a few of those points, because there's a lot, and just that question about making concessions and trying to define what the future will be. I think let's start first in the context of Malaysia. The one thing that defines what we try to do, notwithstanding our motivation, is actually where the funding comes from. Now, in our case, for Kuala Lumpur, it's always been private funding. We've always raised sponsorship, and also a small portion from arts organizations, international partners. Now, that really means that no matter what you want to do, the kind of audience you want to attract, the kind of message you want to do, the kind of communities you want to build, at the end of the day, the pressure really is to show the ROI to your sponsors. And that is something that takes up a lot of energy. And so it limits what you can do, because you really are trying to run it as a sustainable business. You're trying to please your sponsors. Your sponsors now have certain expectations. So that's why it's become very short term. So it's fine and well that we want to talk about, this ideal version of, the audience we want to build for, the kind of things we want to talk about. But you won't really address that until you fix the funding issue. Like, how do you actually sustain a festival in the long term? For us as a private festival, next year, I'm quite happy to say that we'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary, right? I mean, there have been a lot of private festivals that, after a few years, then they disappear. But every year, we don't know whether we're going to do it until we actually come to the opening night and then, oh, okay, we do have a festival, right? I mean, I've literally had sponsors sign the check to us the day before the festival is supposed to open, right? So that's the reality. And I think that it's two discussions that go off on a tangent, and we have not been able to find a way to reconcile it.
Is there a different dynamic depending on whether your sponsors are primarily private companies or whether your sponsors are primarily from the government? I mean, Nadira, you mentioned that in Sabah, the government is largely paying the costs of most of the festivals that are happening. How does that? What is the? If that piper is calling the tune? No, hang on, I'm getting my metaphors mixed up. Anyway, what is the government looking for from paying for those festivals, and does that affect the? Does that have the sort of effect that Hardesh is talking about in terms of his festival, does that also affect the festivals in Sabah?
I mean, I'm gonna stick to talking about Pesta Kaamatan because I mean, like, it's just not many people know about it outside of Sabah. Not many Malaysians know about it outside of Sabah. It's not televised. How am I gonna go towards talking about the future because about the Pesta Kaamatan? It's really important to know that with the Kaamatan celebration in itself, it was made a public holiday after the formation, well, just before the formation of Malaysia, and that was to assert the Kadazan Dusun identity. And it's important because it's an intangible culture, oral language, and therefore when the festival kind of started to materialize, it was actually formed by the Kadazan Dusun intelligentsia at that point. So the Kaamatan festival is incredibly important as a point of nation building. And so there's an incident that happened, and because Sabah and Sarawak don't really have the same access to media representation the way that Peninsula does, so it's really important that people communally, physically are able to sort of like come together and you know, celebrate these things together. When we say cheers, we say aramaiti, ramai, many of us, people, everybody coming together. And that was very much affected by the pandemic. Sorry, I know this is jumping to a tangent, but going back again to the government sort of involvement. So there was an incident in the 1980s during the Berjaya era whereby it caused a big kerfuffle because Haris Saleh, at the time the chief minister, that his administration had wanted to change Pesta Kaamatan and call it Pesta Rakyat, the People's Festival, instead of Kaamatan Festival, because if Kadazan Dusuns were seen to have our own culture, we would be seen as non-Malaysian. We would be seen as non-Malaysian. So it is an important festival because, you know, in the entire climate of Malaysia that pushes Malay supremacy and Islamism, and we've especially seen that with the, you know, the results of this previous election, that we have these huge spaces that are pushing one, you know, like major focal cultures, animism, a lot of alcohol, you know, but they're not televised. But it's actually become, in the last few years, been sort of aired on social media, on Facebook. So technology is we're starting to be able to use technology to sort of like propagate it, but it's still very, very much unstructured. And the government does fund it to a certain extent, but I think people are not looking at the sort of creative economy that exists in Sabah, because it's gone straight from communal to social media. But on national airwaves, the Kaamatan ads are all done by mostly West Malaysians and Digi and all the big corporations. So it's very hard to sort of structure who is going to advance it with a particular vision, especially when the Kadazan Dusun Cultural Association that controls Pesta Kaamatan depends on the regime of the day, which is primarily run by men. It's a major focal celebration, I have to say that.
Yeah. So, Daniel, I'm interested in whether your perspective on this, these tensions, and particularly you work with governments of at different levels all the time. How do you resolve those inevitable tensions?
Yep. First of all, I don't think it's resolved. It's a conversation or discussion that we often had about funding. If I just respond back to what Hardesh has mentioned, I think when we talk about funding, we need to look at diverse funding, and we need to understand that we can't just look at private sector or just purely on government, because everybody is funding this for whatever objective or ulterior motive that they have. So it boils down to very important is about what's that narration. Drawing that narration to, it's like a market strategy, right? Understanding what your client wants and then supply that. So when we go to the government, then we need to talk about long term and how is the festival part of the city evolution or rejuvenation in that sense, and aligning with the city's local plan or whatever plan that they have, because that's how budgeting is being done, following the local plan that they already have. When we go to private sector, then yes, right, sometimes they talk about ROI, sometimes they talk about brand mileage, etc. But I think we also need to talk about not just about the output, but also the outcome and impact. And that goes back to my first point of narration. And also, end of the day, the market drives it as well. So that we also need to talk about audience creation and audience creation, right? Because sometimes even to government, right, they might have like, okay, we want to make this a cultural district, then a festival makes sense. But oftentimes it's ad hoc. The missing is there's a long-term longevity to it, you know, the continuity of it, because these things don't happen overnight. Not 1 year, 2 years, but it's built up. For example, Georgetown, you know, multiple festivals, etc. It took it a decade to get where we are today. So yeah, so narration, understanding what the government or the private sector wants, curate that accordingly, and I think really for the audience, for all of you who are actually participating in a festival, also creating that demand. So it's both sides. It's not just one side looking at the funder, but also looking at what the funder was trying to fulfill in terms of the audience side as well. So it's complex, but I think to begin is actually the narration again, talking about the festival beyond the festival. I think that's where we're able to get different stakeholders to come on board, understand, and there's something for everyone. You know, the city council might be looking at activating certain spaces, private sector might be certain brand mileage or certain venue. It's fine, right? But as a festival, what you can do is actually curate and stitch everything together.
And are you able, with those stakeholders, to move beyond purely economic impact? Because I can understand, you know, you talk about ROI for stakeholders, or you talk about economic growth for governments. There's a temptation always to talk about the numbers, yes. But is there an audience for in stakeholders for a conversation that is about something beyond numbers?
Yeah, they still talk about numbers, but what's the trick is, instead of figuring out how do we get them to understand the outcome or impact that's not by numbers, is actually to put numbers to the outcome and impact. So you talk about spillover effect, you talk about indirect economic impact, you talk about induced impact. So speak the language, turn the new narration around, and I think that's how you get their attention.
Now I think 3 of you in the recent past have been to the UK for various reasons, courtesy of the British Council, who's supporting this talk. Perhaps, Sharaad, I know you went to Edinburgh.
I did, but I just want to say Daniel's an agent of the state.
I think we're all agents of the state in one way or another.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. I just want to because I think this conversation is very interesting, to note that the Gaul Literary Festival collapsed. And I don't know if you, have any of you been to the Gaul Literary Festival in Sri Lanka? It did collapse, and for very specific reasons about the way sponsorship worked and sustainability. But we can get into that if that's of any interest to anybody. But okay, what I did experience around these questions through Edinburgh was, so that was British Council and Creative Scotland, was a sense of a very old festival. It started just after the war, right, with very specific purposes. But I think since I don't really have a sense of that history, except to say that in its current mode, it seems very much animated by a discourse of inclusivity that's already there, that's permeated governance in Scotland. So Scottish politicians, Scottish cultural leaders speak a certain type of language, and it's very distinct. You hear it over and over again, and we were talking about that earlier, weren't we, Adam? So you can hear it, and it sounds like a very clever, progressive state bureaucracy that speaks the language of inclusion, and also speaks to a very dense network, an ecosystem of cultural workers and cultural initiatives. So we were, put in a room with all these people, and who worked in different parts, who fed into the festival. Georgetown, and I think many other festivals, perhaps kind of hover above these things. They're not really connected to the space in which at their events. And so that may be back to your criticism, Daniel, about things that just come and go, right? And I actually have no problems with that personally, ideologically, with things that come and go. But when you have something that's embedded, it does produce other effects. So you see that, at least it was explained to us, that in Scotland you have this proliferation of tiny, very hyper-local festivals. You have this carried on in the school system, and so on. So Georgetown, just to end this, which is say Georgetown is very much connected to Penang state government's sense of tourism. And, and it's parked under the tourism ministry, right? It is. So that's a long-term conversation, whether you should shift to education and whether that would be a good shift and what consequence that would have. But it is. And as a consequence, it's very much about the experience economy here in Georgetown, if you want to talk specifically about this festival.
But I mean, from my perspective in Edinburgh is that, in a way, some of those things you'd reflect on Edinburgh. If Edinburgh City Council or the Scottish Government come and talk to you about Edinburgh, they'll quote you all the economic impact studies, and they'll quote you all the numbers of tourists. That, in a way, quite a lot of the discourse, at least at a stakeholder engagement level, is a lot of the same sort of things that we're talking about in Georgetown.
I'd like to add something, and just because it has to have some outcome from this session. Yes, it's parked under the state government for the Georgetown Festival, but I think one point I want to make is also, what's that KPI when the state government is running the festival? And that also needs to be very clear, and it's not just about bringing in footfall. It needs to be a lot more than that for the festival to be embedded and to be part of the bigger ecosystem. And oftentimes when we talk about tourism KPIs, it's about footfall. It's not about proper, cultural economy or creative economy. It's not about long-term, plan or continuity. I think that needs to change as well, because often when we look at, be it MOTAC or state or whatsoever, it's always footfall. And footfall doesn't translate into economic or social benefit. Not necessary.
Hardesh, you also travelled to the UK this year to visit an enormous festival that was taking place across the UK. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so I was one of 11 people from an international delegation that visited the Edinburgh festivals, because it's a collection of, I think, about 5 or 6 festivals that all happens during the same period. I think, my perspective, and to try to make it meaningful for this conversation, is to try and share some of the areas that would provide us with some questions, in terms of whether the festivals we run here, or even Georgetown Festival, for example. So coming back to this thing about it being state-owned, and I think, we take it for granted that Georgetown Lit Fest is now, maybe 13 years, 14 years, 11, okay. So that's a pretty good run for a festival. But, for us in Kuala Lumpur, the reason we've been so precious and so protective about keeping the festival independent is because we do not want to come to a point where the government can tell us the kind of things we can and cannot do. So bringing it back to Penang, if there was a change in Penang government, for example, then you wonder, okay, what would a new government want the festival to be? And it might be very different from what the festival currently looks like. Now, why I say this is because then you go back to Edinburgh, where the festivals have been going on for, I don't know, KT, 50, 60 years, probably longer. Obviously, over many, many changes in government during that lifetime, but the festival has survived. So who owns the festival in that case? Here, right now, the state government owns the IP for the festival. You wouldn't be able to do anything, even if you wanted to, if the government had a different view of what the festival is meant to do, right? So I think what is interesting also is, because coming back to this question of funding, is that when you look at something like the Edinburgh Festival, it's a huge operation. I tried my best to try and learn a little bit more about the operations, but I didn't have enough time. But I mean, it's amazing the sort of the work that happens behind that. But it's, number one, is independent, and number two is that you see the difference in the approach. Right there, the creative output is so good, but the infrastructure of the festival is obviously built for a very different time. It was built centuries ago, and everyone is trying to retrofit their program into this infrastructure. In Malaysia, you have really wonderful infrastructure, right? Istana Budaya and stuff like that. But we do not have the creative capital to fill it in. So, and the reason for that is because here, when our government talks about funding, and coming back to the sustainability of festivals, it is viewed through the lens of infrastructure. It is always about infrastructure, tangible outcomes, whereas in the West, in Edinburgh, for example, is about the creative output and the sort of human capital first.
Yeah, I mean, from a UK perspective, I'd see that slightly rose-tinted spectacle view of the UK. I think sometimes UK governments have also had an attraction to a big shiny new building there. They can cut a ribbon, and that's viewed as an achievement. But so if we talk about the future, let's think about the future in a specific Malaysian context. How might festivals play a valuable part in the, we're at a moment of potential substantial changes in Malaysia. How might festivals play a valuable part in that, and what do we need to do in order to build a festival sector that can achieve that? Appreciate there's probably a PhD in that, so good luck summing that up. But does anybody have a view of what we need to do to build a stronger festivals environment here?
Okay, everybody's looking at me. Well, I'm going back again to the thought of a cultural festival. I think the issue as well where Sabah is concerned is that the administration isn't very imaginative in terms of when they think about, they conflate tourism and culture. And I personally feel that it's extremely problematic because then it becomes, culture then becomes this performative thing as opposed to something that is for the people. And not being able to tell the difference between that is pretty dangerous, especially when you start to have larger corporations like beer companies and also sort of just like these telco companies coming to sort of sponsor the Kamatan festival. But I don't feel like necessarily the festival is within control of being able to sort of kind of reel back its identity for the Kadazan Dusun or indigenous peoples. And I think the part of the danger in that also kind of lies in how stories about Kamatan are told, and when I think we're not, as Sabahans, as Kadazan Dusuns, we're not able to tell our own, to control our own advertisements. And you have outsiders telling those stories back to us. We don't get to do, it's important to have like Raya films or Christmas films, these festive ads, as trite as they can be. But they are really important, I think, where I feel where this is concerned in being able to sort of remind people what does our culture, what do our values really kind of stand for. We don't have that, as indigenous peoples, we don't have that mirror back to us again to reflect on those values. And I can see it in the festival because most people are drinking beer, which is made out of wheat, during a rice harvest festival. And it's really unfortunate. And the uglier part of the pageants is that there's actually a lot of gambling that happens behind it. So people are betting on women. And one thing that I find that a lot of us in Sabah start getting angry about is that they call these women kuda, horses. So it's treated like horse betting. And so the people who are running these festivals, I don't think that they're necessarily equipped to talk about gender equality in a contemporary sense. So as somebody who's a filmmaker, I think it's really important to speak to a Semenanjung audience as well, again, because the telco companies, again, like all the large corporations are in the peninsula, controlling our narrative, and that affects how our festivals, the spirit of the festivals are run on the ground.
Sharaad, how do you see
hazard
this?
a guess. At this, I don't know if this political moment, is an opportunity to rethink things like festivals. And I think that's just a kind of question that continues. But what is interesting, what this festival, I don't mean to criticize anybody because these festivals are like, are organized because they're so complex, right? The movement of people, they had to be set, and there's a time, there's a program, but not very nimble. So if you were asked to ask me, did Georgetown in any way reflect this momentous political movement? I would say no, right? It's not able to do that. It's not able to kind of shift gear in order to incorporate what's actually happening in the world, right? So can you imagine if suddenly, because we had Anwar Ibrahim, then not Prime Minister, in this very room, engaging in a discussion, if, and because it was impossible to imagine this happening, he came, right? Or somebody came to talk about the politics of the time, what would this room look like, right? If a Rafizi Ramli, I mean, for those who know, he's a senior politician in the main party coalition, if he came and he talked and he addressed people in Penang, they'd be beating down the door to get in, right? But we can't, well, I mean, because he's popular and he's, you know, and he would be representative of this moment in Malaysian history. But festivals, typically, I think, but I don't know enough about, you know, other festivals, but I think because they're a kind of set piece, right? So they lack that. So when we reimagine the future, can we imagine, coming back to my question, I've got a favorite question, Adam, sorry. My question is, what concessions do we make to that future? What concessions do we make to the ways in which people think about what is fun and entertaining, what constitutes community? June Rubis gave a brilliant description of something called Gawai Serumpun, which is an innovation on a tradition, right? And people innovate. I'm very interested that you say that, you know, KDM Intelligentsia started the Kamatan, right? Partly as a kind of nationalist move, right? It's an invention of tradition. I thought of it, you know, but you know, that kind of thing. So I think festivals are just opportunities by various stakeholders to find a way of putting themselves out, of creating community. Sometimes the state is involved, sometimes the state is not involved. I don't know if there's one, but I like literary festivals, but I also fear that they become too niche, and they haven't got a language to speak to a larger audience. I think, again, I don't want to criticize George Tang, I was part of it, and I've been, you know, I was a moderator from the very beginning, right? The first festival, I've always been here, more or less, except barring 1 year, I think. Are we speaking to people in Penang? This is a constant criticism. Any Penangites in the room? Okay, yeah. Tell me about it. 4 hands, 4 Penangites in the room.
I just wanted to share, if I can.
Please do, yeah.
One of my favorite sessions at the Edinburgh Festivals was actually featuring Nicholas Sturgeon, not as a speaker, as a moderator. And yeah, how many of our politicians can be moderators, right? I mean, because, yeah, but that's the thing. We always put them on the seat to be a speaker, right? But I think, I mean, she handled it so well because she did not use the opportunity, even though there was, you know, a lot of.
She produces a list of books she's read for the week. I think every week she tweets this out.
She's
a reader.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, do you have something?
So, I think, I guess if we're thinking about the future festival, I mean, in the context of, say, Kuala Lumpur, are you able to build in the sort of fluidity that we've identified is often lacking? Like, is there a way of creating a festival that has enough of a context to be responsive, to shape, to capitalize on a political moment? Yeah.
I think I'll answer that through, again, coming from point of stakeholders. And I'm going to try and address this, you know, the big question that we are all struggling to answer, you know, in relation to the future of festivals, right? I think the approach, especially for me, because we are starting to think about our festival for next year, the opportunity seems to be going back to this, the ESG approach, right? And I'll explain exactly why. So you have the E, you have the S, you have the G, you know, the environmental, social, and governance, which is now the very sexy speak among corporates, but also it's going to be mandatory because governments all around the world, the stock exchanges are all mandating public listed companies to start adopting certain standards. This is where I think the opportunity comes in terms of us addressing what the future of festivals will look like. Companies do not have any issues with addressing environmental. I mean, there are enough frameworks. When I say no issues, it's really whether they want to or not. There are enough frameworks, there are enough rules, there are enough guidance. In terms of governance, you have your board of directors, you have your regulatory bodies that take care of it. When it comes to social, all of them struggle because they do not know what to do to address the social aspect of ESGs. And they need a lot of solutions there. And I think festivals become one part of that solution. Why? Because now festivals become a platform to work with communities, to work with corporations, to address all these issues that we need to be addressing. When you talk about educating young kids about climate change and stuff like that, you build it into your program. We have a lot of kids programming, but what do? Storytelling. I mean, come on. I mean, so going back to why I was critical about, the work we do and we look back, I mean, nobody needs that. Sure, okay, there's always room for storytelling, there's always room for kids play, but I think we are at a point now where we need to be very consequential about the kind of work we do. So we bring in people to build syllabus into the kids programming that addresses education in terms of climate change. Then everyone who works for us, whether it's vendors, whether it's programmers, whether it's our sponsors, are you yourself equitable in terms of gender? Are you yourself looking at decent wages and stuff like that? So the festival becomes the platform for all of us to work on this. And why it matters is because the corporations will then need to report. They have to provide reports, and they need an opportunity to build in this sort of impact into their reports. Because they don't have a ready way to address that as right now, I think festivals can play that part. So therefore, then you use that as a way to bring in funding mechanisms.
And how, to play devil's advocate for a moment, how do you stop that from being greenwashing?
I think we have to, there were always going to be greenwashing. I think, but you'll need to have the curators to really understand what you want to do. So for example, I think we will know who to work with. If you're building something for kids programming, for example, there will be experts that we can bring in. So there is very minimal way of, well, I think you can build in safeguards to make sure that they don't take it for granted, they don't just use it to dress up their reports without actually creating something of consequence.
Go.
Yeah, I mean, I like what both Sharaad and Hardesh were saying about between, being culturally responsive, but also, that sense of urgency. At least where film festivals are concerned in Malaysia, I don't feel that there's enough of that. Because, I mean, the only film festivals I would sort of trust to be responsive to the current political or social climate would be Freedom Film Fest, maybe Borneo Eco Film Fest, and KL Eco Film Fest. But the film festivals here consistently let us down because the general attitude, sorry, I'm kind of crapping on my own moves, but the filmmakers here refuse to, almost refuse to talk about real issues. It's kind of pushed into the whole entertainment sphere. And so I was really disappointed with this so-called Southeast Asian Short Film Festival, which I won't name, but the name is there somewhere. Because the programmers are all primarily Peninsula Malaysian or from outside of the country, and they don't know how to program for a wider sort of Malaysian conversation, meaning Borneo filmmakers were left out of the fold. There is very little thought in terms of, in my experience, why I became a film programmer was because I just found that the film spaces that were here were just not curated for marginalized communities. I have my privileges, but at the same time, it was just very hard to get my films out there. Even my last short film, Were the Sun and the Moon to Meet, because it was sort of an anti-nationalist film, nobody has seen it here yet. We haven't had a Peninsula premiere for it yet because the programmers just didn't understand the film. And it was very upsetting right after the Sheraton move because the same programmers as well decided to thought it would be fun to do a film pantun workshop. And I'm like, did you guys not notice that PAS just got into government and you want to sort of just have the diaspora sit around and talk about rasa sayang and how beautiful that is? And that lack of responsiveness to me is just a total lack of social responsibility. And when you have, that platform and you're not communicating to the younger generations that, art and your lived experiences are not, that they're intertwined, it's a huge waste of resources.
we have a few minutes for contributions or questions or thoughts from the floor. Does anybody have anything they want to throw in? No? Yes. Katie, here we go. We're offering a... Turn it on.
Is that way it's working?
Yeah, we're good.
From a UK perspective, the way that you get around the issue of either governments or sponsors interfering with censorship with the curation of your programme is that you rely on two things. One of them is differences in scale. So often your sponsors, and certainly your local authorities or your governments, you represent a very, very small percentage of their attention. And the other thing you do is you act as a double agent. So you operate for your sponsors or your funders in order to deliver what they need for them, make sure that they can fill in their reports and all that sort of thing. But then really your heart is with your artists and you deliver the things that they need to support their creative economy and to support their work and support their vision. And I'm interested in to what extent that's possible in a Malaysian context and whether or not that is a privilege of working within the particular circumstances that I work in the UK.
Yeah, so before I come to that is when we were discussing about this, I think the conversation is not just festival directors or curators, etc., but it's also funders. What is funders leveraging on to support, right? And back to what Katie is saying. Yes, we do. So, for example, Think City manages a public grants program, and what we actually do is exactly that. We try to bridge the gap, and we try to curate through the grants program. So, for example, the early years of Georgetown festivals, there was a lot of great shows, but they are all international, also in another way you want to put it is parachute in, and it's done in pockets of Georgetown World Heritage Site. But what was missing was the local participation or the community participation. So it's like I open my door, I look out, there's a great show, but then after that it's done, and so what does that has to do with me? So the first few years of Think City supporting the Georgetown Festival was very specific. It was about community participation. So we did not gave funding to the festival for the festival itself, but we said we're going to support the festival by making sure there's community participation. So all the community who wants to participate in the festival, they can apply for a grant to be part of it. Because the festival might have their constraint based on their funders or whatsoever, but that's what we did. So a success story of that, I hope is still successful, is the Masjid Kapitan Keling Youth Community, IMCOM. So they were very new to all this, right? It's can I say a religious organization, but yet they were very passionate about their history. So it's about their culture, their practices, etc. So we worked with them through the grants program, and for the first year, we fully funded their program to be part of the festival. So during the Georgetown Festival, you actually have a whole program with the mosque. The second year, and we say, look, we can't just keep funding every year and then you're just depending on us. We need to look at sustainability. So we work hand in hand with them for 3 years, where we reduces the funding year by year. And today, well, not today, maybe 4 or 5 years after that, they were self-sustaining. So they were seeking funding from the state. They were running things by their own crowdfunding, and they were doing things beyond Penang. So I think that's an example. So I guess so what we did was we worked closely with them to curate what the state or the festival was looking for. And with the state and the festival, we are leveraging on that to say, look, this is the chance for the community to participate. And another point, the last point is actually back to what I was saying, funders as well. We can't just be talking among here. We also need to be bringing the funders in and say, look, what are you funding towards ESG? What are you funding towards that? Because it needs to be a collective effort and a same trajectory in order to achieve that impact.
Can I just very quickly say, you said double agent, state, and artist, but you left out the audiences, right, in that formulation. You just brought in the audience back into this, in some ways a more grounded, but also maybe practitioner point of view. I think the listener, the audience issue is so huge for the future of festivals. And what I think curators fear, because I've been a curator, is that your festival becomes lowbrow, because that's in fact the community in terms of where it is when it comes to literature and popular culture. Mm-hmm. It becomes, at best, middlebrow. And as a curator, you are ashamed to do anything that smacks of that. So what do? You go to your default setting, you have a highbrow festival, and you don't get people coming. And that is the tragedy. I'm not saying your festival needs to only be one of those things. But if you're not attentive to that, if you make no concessions to popular tastes, if you make no concessions to the way people think about literature and reading, then you're doomed. Sorry, this is the second time I used doomed today.
We are doom-laden right now. We have. Does anybody want to offer another voice? Possibly not a voice of doom, but who knows?
Hi, I was wondering, Hardesh, you mentioned safeguards, but for all of you, what safeguards do you think we need in Malaysia to help festivals be more inclusive and responsive, not just for the programming, but for the audiences as well?
Anybody want to pick that one up?
Thanks for the question. I think just in general, because I also interact with a lot of like young artists and young filmmakers too. I think the issue with Malaysia is that there's a tendency to groom artists, but not curators and cultural workers, and that becomes quite problematic as well. And also there has to be, we need to sort of see more of like that intersect of the role and responsibility of curators to not just, and programmers to not just be thinking about the art itself, but thinking about diversity and inclusion and equity. So it helps. I think we could do with more workshops that try to foster that.
Yes.
I'd like to see international organization play that role.
Mentioning no names.
Is there funding? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Most definitely. Why not? But then when I say international funding, I think it's really important as well to have the intersection between sort of like more developed, countries where this conversation is a lot more developed, but also intersecting that with regional countries. Yeah. Most definitely, because if it becomes just curated by for example another European country, then a whole other subset of caveats appear. But yes to funding.
Any other thoughts or contributions? Or I'm just going to throw in one other thing, which is a massive other subject that we could probably spend another hour on, and we've got about 3 minutes. But the one thing that hasn't come up at all in this conversation yet is technology. And during the pandemic, of course, a lot of us attended quotes, festivals, unquotes, online. I think GTLF had online presence. And if we look forward to another 20 years of technological development, are we all going to be attending festivals wearing VR headsets through the metaverse or whatever that means? Is there a means for, do festivals require physical gathering in the way that we've discussed, or is there a valuable role for the sort of hybrid activity that we started to see operate at in the immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic?
I can respond. So during the pandemic, there was, of course, a lot about digital placemaking, right? How do we still do run festivals when we are all under lockdown? So that has shifted where technology played a big role, where end of the day, festival is about getting people together, right? Be it face-to-face or virtually. And that is something that happened during the pandemic. So people get together virtually and, through technology, you can do so many things, right? You can go hawker, go to street hawking, and then yet you order the food through Grab, and then the food get delivered whatsoever. Performances online where everyone view, blah, blah, blah. But that said, it still beats having physical presence. As much as we can do it virtually, you still need that intimacy to actually build relationship, build trust, and that is what it's all about still, right? So I think end of the day, to answer your question, the future of festival is not just, it's incorporating or integrating technology, but still finding that balance. It's not one or the other.
I mean, the technology aspect is really important. I mean, I spoke a little bit earlier about what happened when like Kamatan started becoming broadcasted online because they couldn't have that physical space as much. But in terms of programming in general for Malaysia, East Malaysians are always the afterthought. East Malaysians are always the kind of like, oh, okay, we have to find a certain token Sabahan Nadira, who do you know? You know, it kind of becomes that way. But I think the good thing about it, taking out the logistical cost of bringing East Malaysian voices to the peninsula, I think at least during the pandemic, actually helped, I think, to broaden some networks at the time. Yeah.
I mean, in the context of, is there a, we talk about the environmental challenge and we talk about the technological opportunity. Is there a happy point of confluence there for technology to be used as part of the means of achieving some of the kind of sustainability goals that you were talking about?
Yeah, actually, I see it slightly differently, but the thing is that it's quite easy to pretend that we would know the answers, but I think we'll figure it out as we go along. The thing about this technology is that I definitely see a way forward for technology to get very, very close to addressing this, you know, experience of a festival, whether in the metaverse and stuff like that. I think there will be people working on that, and I think it will be a reality, and I think it'll come to a point where it could be really amazing. The problem with that is that you then are left with a huge section of society who don't have access to that technology, but also they have never been the audience that festivals have tried to attract. So it now is a double whammy, right? So you could risk going all in on technology. You've built something that is so perfect for, you know, for all those who can afford to buy the latest technology, the latest gadgets, but we keep forgetting about the rest of us, you know, who, by the way, would benefit the most from community.
Absolutely. And I think that's where we're going to wrap up. It's an interesting thought. Getting back to what you were saying earlier about the discourse of inclusivity at Edinburgh, the danger of the technological revolution is that it is, by its very nature, exclusive.
That's not a problem in some contexts. I mean, it's only because in so-called democratic societies they developed that thing that it has to be inclusive. I'm not quite sure if it has to be, and I sometimes fear that inclusivity is just a box you tick, when in fact your festival might be quite elitist. And I don't actually have a problem with elitism, to be honest. I mean, the kind of conversations, I know it's like, oh, shock and horror, but the problem is that we're talking about a particular form, the literary form, books, novels, are a residual form of culture. They're disappearing, right? They're not the dominance television or film, it's visual culture. And, you know, and I like to go to art festivals. Documenta is it's a super elitist thing. It's important. There's nothing wrong with, you know, the lot of cultural artifacts are not super mass. You know, don't have to be. If you want to be mass, then do television. Or at least talk about television. You know, and Kuala Lumpur does, actually. Kuala Lumpur is much more on the pulse with, it's much more mixed, right? It's a festival of ideas rather than a pure play literary festival. Pure play festivals are in danger because it's very difficult. The niche is narrowing, right? I think that's the reality.
And there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion this afternoon. We've got a lot of ideas. I hope everybody around in this room goes away and either curates their own perfect festival or possibly thinks of a lot of reasons why they really shouldn't do that. But I'd like you to please thank all the panel that have taken part, and thank you.